What's going on, guys? Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. I wanted to chat to you today about becoming fluent in a language and expectations, I guess. So, I don't know how many languages you guys speak. You're obviously learning English or have already learnt English to a very high level. If you're watching this video, maybe you are an English speaker who's watching this video and have never learnt another language, or maybe you've learnt 10 languages. I just thought I would sort of share my journey and experiences and just discuss what expectations you should have and how quickly they should, I guess, accrue, right? Or how quickly you should be thinking about getting to a very advanced level in a language. So I guess you guys pretty much know my story if you've been on this channel already, right? I learned languages through primary school and high school. I got to a very limited level in French. That was my best language that I ever learnt at high school. After 6 years, I wouldn't have called myself fluent at the end of those 6 years. I would have said that I could, bumble through a conversation, stumble through a conversation. I could ask for directions. Where's the toilet? Can I order this, please, at a restaurant? But I was by no means able to have a conversation like this in English, right, that I am now. It's not necessarily advanced, but I couldn't just fluidly and fluently speak like this. Fast forward 10 years, and I decided to learn French on my own and spent about 6 months to a year studying at home and speaking with a lot of people, but doing a lot of self-study. So instead of being in a classroom and learning from teachers, I was doing this autodidactically, right? So effectively on your own. I was teaching myself or doing this without a teacher above me giving me direction. So within probably 3 months, I was at the level that I was at school after 10 years. And then within another 3 months, I was definitely what I would have considered fluent, basic fluency. And it was to the point where I could speak quite often with French people who didn't speak English, and I could carry a conversation with them and not feel like I was lost. I wasn't perfect by any means, but I was able to at least keep the conversation going and talking. I could talk about different subjects. Again, I would constantly be in a state of what's this word? What does that mean? They just said something that I don't understand, but I can kind of follow the conversation. So I guess just know that that doesn't really disappear like that. You don't just sort of suddenly wake up one day and are able to understand everything that you hear. Instead, I guess there's a sort of analogy here. It's kind of like people think with fluency that you wake up one day and it's like you were blind yesterday, right? You couldn't see. And then the next day, all of a sudden, your eyes are open and you can see and understand everything. Whereas for me, the experience at least has been much more of you can imagine yourself being blind and slowly getting your vision clearer and clearer and clearer every single day. So it is such a long process. And one day to the next, you probably don't notice any difference, right? It's kind of like you're trying to see, everything's blurry, and the next day it's a tiny little bit less blurry, and then less blurry, and eventually you can make out more of the world around you, right? Language learning, for me at least, has been like that, where I never feel like I've made these huge jumps day to day at all, like maybe in the initial phases of learning a language, but later on, especially now, for example, after having learnt French and Portuguese for many years, when I study, I never feel like I'm making these huge jumps. But you do have those moments where all of a sudden you'll be, say, for example, Australia Day this year, I was at a party with only Portuguese speakers. There were no English speakers, native English speakers there except for me, and I spoke to them just in Portuguese for 8 hours. Sometimes I had to use English where I was unsure about a word because they speak it, but I think their English is about at the same level as my Portuguese. So it wasn't like I was getting a massive amount of help from their English. And that was when it was one of those situations where I've spent all this time studying the language, and suddenly you have a moment like that occur where you realize, oh, I've actually come a long way, right? It's kind of like a journey. You're climbing a mountain, climbing Everest. Every step doesn't feel like much, but then all of a sudden, after a day or two, you turn around and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm, several kilometers up a mountain. So my experience has been like that. And it's really funny. Like I feel like in Portuguese, at least, I've gotten to a very good level of a certain set of the language. I cannot talk about things that I effectively haven't practiced, right? So if I don't study talking about science or medicine or physics or the universe, those sorts of things, I can't really hold a conversation, bare minimum. Or I can, but it will be, how do I say this? How do I say this? How do I say this? Because I haven't built up that vocabulary. But living at home at the moment with Portuguese every single day with my wife, we've been speaking pretty much every single day just in Portuguese, or at least the majority of the time in Portuguese for probably 6 months or more now, maybe more. And so now it's at a point where I feel like I am definitely fluent. I wouldn't say native level at all, but it's not with the whole language. It's with this core of the language that I use on a daily basis that I've become really, really good at. And so that's been something really funny and eye-opening to learn, the fact that you kind of, when you first take on a language, you think, how am I ever going to learn this whole language, right? And you kind of don't realize that even in your own language, you haven't learnt everything. You can navigate the language very easily, but you don't necessarily know all the vocabulary, all the expressions, all the grammar back the front, although you'll have a good grasp of it. And yet we put that kind of expectation on ourselves when we're learning a foreign language, like, crap, I need to learn every single grammatical rule and I need to know it perfectly. I need to learn as many, if not all, the words in the language, right? As many words as possible. And I won't consider myself fluent until that time. But something that sort of occurred to me is that you can become fluent really quickly. It's just what sort of amount of the language you're fluent in, right? So with Portuguese, at least, I feel like I have a really, really high level of fluency in day-to-day conversation. What are you doing? How are you going? Do you want to have some lunch out at a restaurant? Blah, blah, blah. I don't have to think. The words come out. I still make mistakes, but it's effortless. It's gotten to the point now where I've done that for so long, it just comes out, and it's not an active process of thinking. I just think, and I say what I want to say. But it is funny that it's kind of like in this case, a metaphor would be you're a race car driver, right? And you're going along a track. And at the moment, I've gotten used to turning, I've gotten used to certain corners. Imagine that, I don't know, I guess it's a track that's ever expanding, You're racing around a city and there's one track around that city that you currently take and you get really, really good at it. You could do it with your eyes closed. But all of a sudden, another part of the track opens up that's new. And when you drive in there, you have to kind of take it easy, you have to suss it out. You have to learn all the new routes, the corners, and then build up that kind of ability to drive through there efficiently, right? And I feel like it's the same now with Portuguese and with French to some extent, that it's more like I'm unlocking different areas of fluency now and adding them to the core that I've built up. So I guess my main reason for wanting to make this video was talking about how important it is to build up that core around your whatever language it is, in English in this case, and how important it is to keep practicing the stuff that you're constantly going to be using, right? I remember, especially with Portuguese and French, I was always learning some obscure vocabulary. I was like, how to talk about sharks, or the kinds of things you're never really going to bring up in conversation, right? So you're effectively wasting a whole amount of time on something that isn't going to have the same kind of utility for you when you're speaking. And so that sort of made me reassess and realize I don't need to learn all of this stuff that I'm never going to use. I need to focus all my time, or at least the majority of my time, on the stuff that I'm going to be using the majority of the time. And you guys are probably thinking, well, no duh, right? But that's something that I sort of came to realize. And it's a big burden lifted off your shoulders when you realize that. When you realize that you don't need to nail every single grammatical part of a language. You don't need to say the perfect you don't have to use the perfect tenses every single time you talk, right? If you use the wrong past tense, people will still understand. For instance, in Portuguese and French, they have gendered nouns, so you have to say masculine or feminine depending on the object, and it changes. And there doesn't tend to be a pattern in, like a chair is a male and a table is a female. You just have to learn that. But I got to a point where I'm like, I don't care. Like I'll learn it, but I'm not going to give myself a hard time if I forget that a chair is a female and I use the male version. They're going to understand me. So my focus now with those two languages is just building that core up to have a really solid foundation in the language. And I think you guys can do this in English. How do you do this? I guess is the question. First and foremost, I would be, as I always say with my students, focus on learning the English you're going to use every single day. One way of doing that can be proactively, where you're looking up online about topics that you talk about all the time and then learning the vocab and everything. The other way is where you are having conversations and you take note of the kinds of grammar that you're using, the kinds of tenses you're using, the kinds of subjects you're talking about in that sense, and then you go home and you practice them. So yeah, that was about all I wanted to really talk about in this video. Don't give yourselves a hard time. Don't aim to perfect every area in the language, because memory doesn't really work like that, right? You can't hold on to that amount of information perfectly. Memory is much more, if you use it, you'll remember it more and more and more and more. The quicker it'll come in your mind, right? And the less you use it, the less quickly it's going to come to your mind, the less easy it's going to be to remember, and rightly so, because it's not that important. So your brain constantly needs to sort of shuffle the important stuff to the front and the unimportant stuff to the back. So don't give yourself a hard time for forgetting things. Don't give yourself a hard time for not saying things perfectly. The ultimate goal with learning any language is getting that core together where you can communicate. And then after that, it's kind of just polishing, right? It's unlocking different areas and adding it to that core and slowly expanding that core out. So that's about it, guys. I think there were a few other things I wanted to talk about, but we'll get to that another time. So I hope you've enjoyed my sort of rambling thoughts on the subject, and I'll chat to you soon. See ya.